Great to have everyone joining us today. Thank you very much. As I said a minute ago, you're automatically placed on mute, but if you can remain on mute for the duration of the session, that would be great. We are recording today's session, and this will be shared with you as soon as it's ready. And one of the things, we want this to be reasonably interactive, so please feel free to ask questions throughout the session using the chat function. And what we'll do is we will look to pick these up at the end of the session, if that's okay. Okay, let's get started. Yeah, a very warm welcome to the Data Privacy Spring Clean Update session. I'm David Goodbrand, a partner in the technology and commercial team and head of the data privacy practice at Burness Paull. I am joined today by 3 senior associates from our data privacy team. We've got Sonia Hart, Denise Scott McGeechee, and we're delighted to be speaking to you all today. And now the team, of which the 4 of us form part, work with a range of local, national and international businesses and organizations, including some world-leading technology businesses, to deliver successful data privacy solutions to our clients in a down-to-earth way. We will run a session as a discussion and would welcome your questions and feedback. As I said earlier, if you've got any questions, please just pop them in the chat function and we'll try and get round to picking them up at the end. There are so many hot topics in data privacy just now, but today we are going to look at 3 topics that come up fairly regularly in our discussions with clients. So that's why we've chosen these topics, and hopefully we will pick up on some top tips and things to think about when you're undertaking your own data privacy spring clean. So with various legislative changes already happening and more to come, we think now is the time to start to review and refresh your organization's data privacy compliance processes, policies, and to ensure they're really up to date. So where to begin? We're going to start off with Sonia, who we're going to speak about carrying out a spring clean, carrying out a data protection gap analysis. We're then going to look at data privacy impact assessments with Denise, how to go about undertaking these, and some points to think about. And finally, we catch up with Scott on data transfers and managing your international transfers and some updates on that. So let's kick things off with Sonia, if that's okay, who's going to chat over a chat about spring cleaning and various data protection compliance activities. So Sonia, hi. We've recently carried out a number of data protection gap analysis for various businesses. Why is it a good time, do you think, now to consider data protection compliance? Why are businesses looking at refreshing what they're doing now?
Well, David, there are various reasons why it might make sense to do a data protection audit. And what we're finding right now quite commonly is that for many businesses, it's been quite a few years since they've last taken a more thorough look at their data protection compliance processes and documentation. So when GDPR came into force in 2018, there was a big push to get everything in place. And at that time, a lot of organizations were doing these kinds of audits and considering what they had to do to get to a compliant position. But in many cases, it seems that data protection has not been looked at in a comprehensive way in organizations since then. So many businesses kind of think it's overdue. There can be also a motivation to simplify things. So for many businesses, the amount of different data protection documents has grown, but it might be that those documents might not work well together, or they might conflict, or they might actually go over and above what's actually required in the minimum legal requirements. So having a fresh pair of eyes on all of that can be a very welcome thing for a business, and just having like a sense check of how it all works together. Also, UK has left the EU, so that means that there will be some data protection documentation updates that need to be done. So, for example, updating the references to UK law rather than EU law and so forth. And because of Brexit, there's also changes to international transfers and the mechanisms that can be used to make international data transfers, which Scott will talk about later. So documents might have to be updated to accommodate that too.
So quite a lot to think about there. You mentioned Brexit, and I think earlier this month the new data protection bill was before Parliament again, has been in the news. Can you tell us a wee bit more about that?
Yeah, that's right. So the UK government has presented its new version of the Data Protection and Digital Information Bill earlier this month. The previous bill that was scrapped late last year around the times of Liz Truss, I think. So just to give you kind of a general overview, so in many cases, the bill aims to lighten the data protection requirements on businesses in many ways. But I suppose when you're thinking about refreshing things and having like a spring clean, legislative updates are a good opportunity to have a wider think around your compliance generally.
Sure, yeah.
And likewise, if there's changes in the data processing within an organization, that might also be a good prompt for an audit. So if the processing has changed in some way, then that might mean that you again have to refresh your documentation. So things like privacy notices, records of processing, all of that might have to be updated. And there might also be a requirement to do data protection impact assessments or consider legal grounds for processing, for example. So sometimes organizations haven't been that diligent in updating the documents along the way when things change. And then other reasons to carry out an audit. So compliance reasons. So if an organization's had a data breach or something like that, might be a good thing to consider to prevent that from recurring. And ultimately, I guess it's a risk mitigation measure. So organizations, they want to stay on top of data protection to avoid the bad publicity and potential fines that could occur in the worst case scenario if they get data protection wrong. So it's a tool to help with compliance. And in data protection, there's this emphasis on demonstrating and documenting and evidencing compliance. Yeah. So audits are a good way to prove that you're compliant as well. And it's all about kind of raising awareness of data protection and information security in the organization too.
Sure, and nothing stays the same. Businesses will develop and grow, and how they're processing data will change over time. And yeah, it's important to, I suppose, keep up to date with all of that as well. So I suppose another area where we see a lot of focus on data protection gap analysis is when it comes to corporate due diligence. Do you think a company might benefit from a DP audit if they're looking at any form of transaction, a deal or investment into the company?
A data protection gap analysis can help with deal readiness. So if there is any kind of investment or M&A, particularly if it's a data-heavy business, and particularly if there's a fear that data protection might not be fully in order, and that might cause delays in the deal later on, then potentially, yeah.
Okay. Well, we've talked about sort of why we might want to go about doing a gap analysis, but what does a typical gap analysis exercise look like?
It can really take many forms, and it kind of on a case-by-case basis. And it can depend on what materials the business has available, what they currently have, how they work as an organization, and what the ultimate aim of the gap analysis exercise is. And normally when we carry this out, we will always kind of agreed the remit and what the gap analysis will cover in advance. But normally it can kind of either be a desktop review of documents, or it can be more involved in terms of talking to people in the business, who know how data is handled in the business. So for example, you might talk to HR about what's done with employee data in the business. There might also be questionnaires that are completed by relevant people in the business and considered as part of the audit. And I would say almost always it will involve looking at documents that the business has around data protection. So things like data protection policies, privacy notices, cookies notices, and really anything else that there is on data protection. I'd say also that it's more common to have that kind of desktop review, a document review these days. So I would say in early days of GDPR, the more involved reviews where you'd go into the business and talk to various people were more common, but now it's more of a document review and refresh on that basis. There will usually also be some questions asked from the business, so either at the start of the review or as things emerge in the course of the review. And the kinds of questions, I guess, that the business will be asked or, would have to think about as part of the data protection audit will involve things like, what data there is in the business and who does it relate to? What is this data used for? Is it shared with third parties or transferred internationally somewhere? What have these individuals, data subjects, been told about the processing? So privacy notices and things like that. And then generally around what are the internal processes and governance around data protection in the business.
Yeah, so I think it's really important to understand the data flows within the business and to make sure the data flows are recognized and also the documentation really speaks to those so that they are up to date. Let me just see where we, so I think we've talked about gap analysis, including a lot of information gathering, then assessing the business's position against the legal requirements. Is that how you see it?
Yeah, that's right. And then, so there's the information gathering part, and then there's the synthesizing it and considering that against the legal requirements part as well. So, does the business meet the minimum standard of data protection? Have they got the minimum kind of legal required documents in place? It will be flagged if there's any non-compliances that emerge during the review. And does it all work kind of consistently together? So, for example, are there conflicts with the documents and things like that? And then what are the improvements that can be implemented by the business to improve their compliance and also make it easier for the business? But I guess in my kind of recent experience, I think the consistency piece has been quite important, and that's where some of the value add is as well, in terms of just rationalizing it and making it as neat and lean as possible.
And I think one important point is it's in these exercises, it's not just one department or division or a team that should be involved in it. It really should be a cross-business activity, because it's only then you get to see all the data flows across the businesses. So what can clients expect, or what can you expect as a deliverable? What was the output of some of this data protection gap analysis work?
So normally it's some sort of a report setting out the findings. So for example, what we've been doing recently is kind of a red, amber, green RAG report type thing that sets out the key findings and then the recommendations in order of priority.
Yeah.
Sometimes also, again, depending on the remit of the gap analysis, but one of the outputs could be updating the record processing or the data map for the business, which is a key compliance document anyway. So it's something that businesses should have.
Interesting. That's good to know. And we'll maybe come back to the record processing later. So can the ICO also carry out compulsory audits? What's the ICO's involvement in all of this?
So ICO can carry out compulsory audits, but they can also carry out agreed upon consensual audits. However, I don't know about your experience, David, but in terms of the consensual audits, I don't know about many companies that would have taken ICO up on that, because and part of the reason might be that ICO publish summaries of their audits, even the consensual ones. Is that how you're finding as well, that not many companies are really,
I would have thought so. So are there any common findings across these exercises? Any common themes or trends that you normally find, or issues that arise?
So I guess the themes that arise for us, I'll go into a couple of them. So the record processing is one. So generally organizations should have one. And it's kind of a live document that you should keep updated in the business and updated as there's changes in the processing. But what we quite often find is that the record of processing is either not there or it hasn't been kept updated. So that's certainly one area that we're finding quite often needs improving. Then another one is privacy notices. So if you're a controller, there's generally that requirement to provide a privacy notice to individuals. And businesses do that, but we quite often find some gaps. So it might, for example, be that not all individuals whose data is processed are actually provided with a privacy notice. So we're able to kind of identify those gaps. So for example, quite often a company will have a privacy notice for employees, but they might not have anything for job applicants or contractors or external vendors, for example. But what that doesn't mean is that you will have to start drafting a ton of new privacy notices. In many cases, it might be possible just to update the existing privacy notices to cover more situations, essentially. Another kind of area where we quite often end up flagging issues is the legal grounds for processing. So there again, controllers should identify, or the general requirement there is for controllers to identify legal grounds for processing of personal data, which would then be set out in the privacy notice. And obviously those grounds might differ depending on what data it is and for what purpose it's used. But what we find quite commonly is that the grounds haven't been fully identified, or they're not fully correct, or that there might be other grounds that could be relied on as well. So, for example, if there's sensitive data being processed, so things like health data, it's a fairly common issue that the legal grounds to process that haven't been fully considered, or sometimes there might be over-reliance on consent. So consent is stated as the legal basis where it's not necessary to use consent, for example.
Right.
And then DPIAs is another area. And I will let Denise talk to that in more detail.
Good. Well, that certainly is a number of different areas. I think it's some common themes coming through there. Any other themes or any other thoughts coming out of some of these audits?
Well, for some organizations, direct marketing can be a big topic. So there are certain pitfalls for direct marketing compliance, particularly if it's done electronically and it's business to consumer. So you might need consent in some cases, and rules where consent is not needed are slightly complicated. So that's one of the kind of hotspot areas where some businesses could improve. Direct marketing is also where a lot of the ICO fines are. And then I guess third-party processing and data sharing is another one where we find that maybe organizations don't always have a clear picture of all the third parties to whom they provide personal data. So there might be limited awareness around that, and that might mean that the minimum legal requirements that you need, for example, for a controller process or contract might not be met. And likewise, sometimes if there's data sharing or processing among companies within the same group, that might also, trigger some requirements that companies might not be aware of.
Well, I think even in that short session, we've covered quite a lot of ground and lots of different things to think about and be aware of and perhaps consider. What are your top tips for gap analysis for spring cleaning your compliance? What would you say would be your top tips?
Well, I suppose having buy-in at all levels of the organization is really important. You already mentioned that various teams and departments should be involved. So HR, IT, sales, really across all departments, and just that kind of message that it's a collective effort. So you need that buy-in from all levels of the business for it to really work. Also, being kind of fully transparent and providing complete information for the audit will be really helpful. And then just starting to have that understanding in terms of what data there is and what it's used for will always be good. And I guess in terms of desktop reviews, the other thing to flag is that that can be document focused. So if the business has an understanding and the practical information around a documentation says this, but that's not actually how it works in practice, that can be really helpful to flag, because then that will also feed into the analysis. But all in all, it's not a box ticking exercise, and all about kind of engendering that culture of compliance as well. So taking that approach, I think, will be the top tip.
That's a good one to finish on, that engendering that culture of compliance across the organisation by doing these exercises. I think that's absolutely right. So thanks, Sonia. We're going to now sort of move on to speak to Denise. We mentioned in this session their data privacy impact assessments. And again, it's a topic that seems to come up in our discussions with clients about what's required, what's needed, when do you need to do them. So Denise, we're going to have a catch up on those. So just to start off with, Denise, what is a DPIA, a data privacy impact assessment, and what is its purpose?
So a data protection impact assessment, it's a process to help you to analyse, identify and minimise the data protection risks of a project. It helps to assess the likelihood and the potential severity of any impact the processing might have on individuals. And it's a really key part of accountability obligations under UK and EU GDPR. It really helps to build and demonstrate compliance. So a DPIA should be carried out prior to the processing beginning, and it's ultimately the responsibility of the controller to ensure it's carried out. But it can involve other third parties, as Sonia mentioned, and that could be the DPO, if there is one, any processors and other stakeholders in the business. It doesn't have to eradicate all risk, but it should help to minimise and determine whether or not the level of risk in a project is acceptable in the circumstances, taking into account the benefits that you want to achieve. But it also doesn't have to be really complex or really time consuming. It just has to be thorough enough in proportion to the privacy risks that are arising in a project. There isn't really a definitive DPIA template that you have to follow. You can develop your own internally, which is relevant and proportionate for your own industry or sector, and based around your particular needs. But it's you need to be aware that carrying out a DPIA is actually more of a continual process rather than a one-time exercise. So you might need to repeat individual steps of the process as a project develops, because the selection of any technical or organisational measures can affect the severity or the likelihood of the risks posed by the processing. It can feel a bit overwhelming, there's quite a lot of information there, but we do have an awful lot of experience of carrying these out. We do develop DPIAs for clients all the time, so we can definitely help with this if you need it.
A good overview at the start as to what's needed. So, I mean, are there situations where DPIAs are compulsory?
So a DPIA is required for any processing that's likely to result in a high risk to individuals' rights and freedoms. But some types of processing do automatically require a DPIA, and some specific examples are provided in guidance provided by the ICO and the European Data Protection Board. And that includes processing of special category or criminal offence data on a large scale, if you're processing biometric or genetic data, and particularly processing around children's data, if the processing is for marketing purposes or to offer online services directly to children, these are all taken quite seriously. Outside of the specific examples in terms of what might be considered high risk, the legislation does set out some specific criteria that you have to consider to help apply the test. And the criteria include things like the matching or combining of data sets. So particularly if they come from different controllers, data that's processed on a large scale, and then processing of data concerning vulnerable data subjects. So that could include the mentally ill, the elderly, or children that we've mentioned before, but it can also include employees due to the kind of imbalance of power in that relationship. And that's often a surprise for some businesses, that employees are considered to be vulnerable data subjects. Other areas that are considered high risk, so any automated processing, which in particular analyzes or predicts performance at work, reliability or behavior in order to create personal profiles, or automated decision-making with significant effects, as well as any systematic monitoring of a publicly accessible area on a large scale. These are all likely to be considered high risk. And the ICO also lists processing involving the use of innovative technology or the novel application of existing technologies. So that would include AI as having the potential for high risk. A few practical examples of high risk processing includes a hospital processing its patients' genetic and health data, the gathering of public social media data for generating profiles, or a company systematically monitoring its employees' activities. And that could include the monitoring of an employee's workstation or internet activity. But ultimately, it's really good practice to do a DPIA for any other major project which requires the processing of personal data. And if you're ever in any doubt, we highly recommend you do a DPIA.
Interesting. Okay. You mentioned there innovative technologies, and that could potentially be high risk. Interested to hear a wee bit more about what does innovative technologies mean in this context. You mentioned AI, but anything else you can say on that?
Yeah, this term tends to concern, it's more about new developments and technological knowledge in the world at large, rather than technology that's just new to a business. The personal and social consequences of deploying new technology can be unknown, and a DPIA can help a controller to really understand and control the risks.
Right, yeah.
But some examples include, as I mentioned, artificial intelligence, could also include machine learning, deep learning, connected autonomous vehicles or intelligent transport systems. But it also includes things like smart technology, so wearable devices, and market research involving neural measurement, such as emotional response analysis and brain activity. But it is not just the kind of cutting edge technology that could be classed as innovative. If an existing technology is implemented in a new way, that could also result in a high risk that might not be identified unless a DPIA is carried out.
Interesting. So, and we've talked about sort of situations where it may be required or compulsory. Is there situations where it's not required? What's this sort of bar to where we need to get involved in a DPIA?
So DPIAs, there are a few situations where it's not required, and that can be where there isn't a high risk to the rights and freedoms of natural persons, or it might be that a DPIA has already been carried out for similar processing already, so you can rely on that existing DPIA. And sometimes there's a legal basis for the processing in the jurisdiction. So that's some examples, but they tend to be very context specific. So you need to look into those quite carefully.
Interesting. Okay, good. So if we have to do a DPIA, what and we're thinking it might result in high risk individuals. What are the sort of key elements you would say? What are the key issues you need to think about when you're doing a DPIA process?
So as I mentioned earlier, you need to kind of start your DPIA very early in the process.
Yeah.
So, that should begin early in the life of a project before the processing begins, and then it should run alongside the planning and development process. And there are a few key steps that I'll go through. So first, you need to identify the need for a DPIA. So you need to check if your processing is on the list of types of processing that might automatically require a DPIA. And if not, then you need to screen for other factors that may indicate it's a type of processing that's likely to result in a high risk, such as processing of special category data, for example. Then you need to describe the processing, and you need to really get into the detail here and really understand what's being carried out. And so you need to include details of the nature, the scope, the context, and the purposes of the processing. And that would include, for example, how the data is collected and stored, who has access to the data, any security measures that are in place, whether new technology is being used, the volume and variety of the personal data, the duration of the processing, and the geographical area that's being covered. In terms of the context of the processing, you might need to include details about the source of the data or the nature of the relationship you have with the individuals, and also how likely individuals are to expect the processing. And in terms of the purpose of the processing, that's a reason that you want to process the data. And so that should include details of your legitimate interests and where that's relevant, the intended outcome for individuals, and also the expected benefits for you or for society as a whole. Another kind of key area is consultation. So that's another important aspect of this process. You really have to consider carefully whether consultation is needed, and the advice of your DPO should be sought if there is one, but also the views of other stakeholders, and that can include the data subjects themselves or their representatives, which could be a campaign or consumer group, something like that. They should also be considered if appropriate. And if you decide not to consult those individuals that are involved in some way, you need to record why you feel this is inappropriate. And that might be because the consultation might compromise your commercial confidentiality or undermine security in some way, or just be disproportionate or impractical. And these are all good reasons why you might not consult. So next, you have to assess the necessity and proportionality of the processing. And that includes specifying the lawful basis for the processing and considering whether there's an alternative, more reasonable way of achieving the purpose, which in turn then enables you to identify and assess the risks involved in a project, including identify details of the potential impacts to the rights and freedoms of the data subjects and the likelihood and also severity of any risks. Then you can identify measures to mitigate the risks, and that can include adding security measures or other safeguards. That might include encryption, or could involve minimizing the duration of the processing or limiting retention times, that kind of thing. Before finally you sign off on the DPIA, you record all the outcomes and then move to incorporate them into the plan for the project.
There's quite a lot of things there to consider. I suppose not all things are relevant to each and every processing activity, but I suppose there's clearly a checklist of things you need to think about as you're going through that. So what are some of the other potential risks to data subjects that need to be considered?
Yeah, I mean, I won't, there's not really an exhaustive list, but there are certainly a few things worth considering. So you need to be careful about the possibility of, for example, inappropriate disclosure of personal data internally within an organization. And that could be due to a lack of appropriate controls being in place. You want to have access controls, password protection, that kind of thing.
Right.
You need to have take care, to ensure that appropriate security is in place to prevent, where possible, any breach of data, which is held electronically by hackers, for example. Information that's released in anonymized form might lead to a disclosure of personal data if the anonymization techniques that are chosen turn out not to be particularly effective, or personal data might be used for purposes that aren't expected by data subjects due to a failure either to explain effectively how the data will be used to the data subjects, or it could be due to an evolution in the nature of a project. And I guess, merging of data sets can result in a controller having far more information about an individual than was anticipated by an individual. And so all of these potential risks can be identified, as you go through a DPIA process.
Okay, so what are the benefits of carrying out a DPIA and summarizing where we've got to?
Sure. So I guess, one really important point is that it can improve awareness of the data protection risks associated with a project. And that in turn can help to improve the design of a project by enabling, the organization to incorporate data protection by design and getting safeguards in place at a very early stage. And it also really helps to kind of enhance awareness and communication about data protection risks within a business and with all the relevant stakeholders. That obviously can lead to improved data protection compliance, and so lowers the risk of sanctions being applied, and can ultimately lead to public confidence in a business by ensuring that users or consumers are aware that they're not at risk of their data protection rights being violated, and that in turn can lead to increased goodwill. Other benefits include reducing your operating costs by optimizing information flows within a project, eliminating unnecessary kind of data collection and processing, and reducing the cost and disruption of data protection safeguards by integrating them into the project, at an early stage, instead of having to try and reverse engineer them, into a project later on. And it's also, important to be aware that failure to carry out a DPIA when that is required, or carrying out a DPIA in an incorrect way, or failing to consult a regulatory authority when that's necessary, can result in a fine. And you obviously want to avoid that at all costs if you can.
Absolutely. So what can we do? What processes can we put in place to manage this?
Yeah, there's a number of things I'd recommend that be put in place to help to manage the DPIA process. It's really good practice to provide training to staff so that they understand the need to consider a DPIA at the early stages of a project involving personal data. Making sure that any existing policies and procedures that you have in place include references to the requirement for a DPIA where that's appropriate.
Yep.
It's also really useful to create and use screening checklists to help identify the types of processing that need a DPIA. And we can help create one for you if you need support with this. Really important to have a documented DPIA process and at least one DPIA template, and then even more specific training for relevant staff on how to carry out a DPIA effectively.
Okay, cool. So I mentioned the regulator, the ICO, a few times. Do you need to consult the ICO when you're doing these things? What's the ICO's role?
So sometimes you don't need to consult the ICO on every DPIA that you carry out, but you must consult the ICO if a DPIA identifies a high risk and you can't take measures to reduce that risk. So there might be an inherent high risk that can't be mitigated. And in that scenario, you can't begin the processing until the consultation process has been completed. Currently, response times from the ICO are generally in the region of around 8 weeks, although that can be extended by up to a further 6 weeks in complex cases.
Okay, so you have to build that time period in if required, if it's high risk. So finally, Denise, any top tips to successful DPIAs?
Yeah, definitely. So having a documented procedure in place for managing and carrying out DPIAs is really important, including developing, I would say, one or more template DPIAs for this purpose. Making sure you document your thinking at each stage, and good record keeping during the process can really allow you to demonstrate compliance with data protection legislation and minimise the risk of a new project creating legal difficulties. And that's something that the ICO in particular really look for. They want to see that you've really thought about something and kind of documented that your outcomes. You really need to train your staff so that they understand the need for DPIAs and how to carry them out effectively. If in any doubt at all about the risks involved in any processing that you're doing, carry out a DPIA. It tends to be during this process that the real risks and the opportunities to manage those risks come to light.
Right, yeah.
And always consider whether there's any other reasonable way to achieve the same result. And ask for professional input if you need it.
Obviously. Denise, that's great. Thanks. That's a tour around DPIAs and why they're needed. Let's move on to Scott and picking up on our final section. There can't be many people who have not heard that the law in relation to international data transfers has changed in the last few years, Scott. So I wonder if you could start us off with just providing a summary of the basic rules when it comes to data transfers under the UK regime.
Yeah, no problem, David. So when we talk about data transfers, we're talking about transferring personal data from a controller or processor based in the UK, known as a data exporter, to a controller or processor based in a country outside the UK, known as a data importer. This can include actively sending the data over to the data importer or making it accessible to them. This will often apply when using technology service providers based in overseas jurisdictions. In practice, the main transfer mechanisms under the UK GDPR are UK adequacy regulations, which is where the UK government determines that another jurisdiction has an adequate system of data protection, and therefore data can flow freely with organisations based in that jurisdiction. Or the other method or mechanism is putting in place appropriate safeguards via standard data protection clauses. This essentially involves putting in place template clauses with the data importer. These are clauses approved by the ICO or the UK government that are deemed to provide sufficient contractual protections in order to allow data to be transferred to the organisation in a non-adequate country. But I'll discuss that in further detail, including the post-Brexit changes to the previous EU-based regime. For completeness, I should also mention there are binding corporate rules for intragroup transfers and a short list of derogations for transfers in specific one-off cases. However, these rarely come up in practice.
So the I suppose the focus is on adequacy decisions and the standard contractual clauses. So we're looking at adequacy. So is it correct there's only a small handful of countries that are recognised as adequate by the EU?
That's right, David. Yeah, just a small number of around 14 jurisdictions, territories recognised as adequate by the UK and EU. Thankfully, there's mutual recognition of adequacy by the UK and EU while they have near identical data protection legislation in place, although that there's going to be slight changes with the new data protection bill coming in. And for now, both the UK and EU recognise the same overseas jurisdictions as being adequate, including major economies such as Switzerland, Japan, Canada, and South Korea.
Interesting. Okay, good to know. USA was in the news with Schrem's decision and various other things. Are there any key developments in relation to data transfers to the USA?
Yeah, definitely. So with regards to the US, the EU had previously issued an adequacy decision for US-based organisations who had signed up to the US government's Privacy Shield programme. However, as you mentioned, this was overturned by the European Court of Justice in the Schrems II case. Now, thankfully, it looks like the US and EU are putting in place a new data privacy framework, which will replace Privacy Shield. The European Commission's new adequacy decision will likely be finalised in the next few months, and this will allow data to flow freely from the EU to US-based organisations who have signed up to these data privacy framework principles. And we also understand that parallel negotiations are currently underway between the US administration and UK government. So we expect the UK government will likely adopt similar adequacy regulations for US organisations later this year. And this will be great news when it's finally confirmed, because many technology providers, as you know, are based in the US and already signed up to Privacy Shield. So this will help to reduce the administrative burden for reviewing transfers to such organizations.
Yeah, so and so these once this regime is in place, these organizations,
once it's in place,
signed up, effectively you wouldn't need to look at adequacy or any standard contractual clauses, because if signed up to these, so that would be a benefit. So what are the post-Brexit changes that have been introduced in the UK for data transfers?
So in 2021, after Brexit took full legal effect, the European Commission issued their new standard contractual clauses, which replaced the old version under the 1995 Data Protection Directive. The new SECs are mainly drafted to bring data protection clauses in line with the requirements of the GDPR and latest commercial practices, and also to address the deficiencies highlighted by the Schrems II case, including the need for transfer risk assessments. While the EU had the new SECs in 2021 under UK law post-Brexit, we were left in the bizarre situation where it was still a legal requirement in the UK to use the EU's old SECs for data transfers to non-adequate countries. But thankfully, the ICO updated the position by issuing a new form of standalone contract for data transfers known as the International Data Transfer Agreement, or IDTA. This is a shorter and more user-friendly document in comparison to the SECs. For example, it doesn't adopt the modular approach, and it doesn't override the Article 22 controller processor clauses that parties will have already negotiated under their main agreement. But even more importantly, the ICO has recognised that the EU's new SECs can still be used as a valid mechanism for data transfers under the UK GDPR. This is subject to putting in place the ICO's UK addendum document, which essentially just substitutes EU references for UK references in the new SECs, including UK GDPR in place of EU GDPR and English law in place of member state law. And we find that most multinational organisations definitely prefer to use the new SECs plus the UK addendum rather than the standalone IDTA. That's just simply because the new SECs in place. It's because they already have the new SECs in place for EU data transfers, and they can therefore achieve compliance with UK requirements by simply adding on the template UK addendum to existing contracts and templates. And there is also more sort of familiarity in the wider industry with the SECs, which can now be used for all 27 countries of the EU plus the UK.
So the EU SECs are for transfers out with Europe, and then the UK addendum is generally being used for transfers of data out with the UK.
Yeah, essentially you just tack it on to your existing one, and that sort of makes the process easier, and allows the same sort of principles and approach to be used, for all transfers outside both the EU and UK.
Cool. So, I mean, are there any upcoming dates or deadlines that we should be aware of, particularly in relation to the UK position?
Yeah, definitely. In terms of dates, the position is that, well, with effect from 21st September last year, all new contracts which involve data transfers to non-adequate countries must essentially use either the IDTA or the new SECs plus the UK addendum. But for any existing contract that was in place before 21st September last year, the ICO has confirmed that it's still possible to rely on the old SECs for data transfers for a transitional period until 21st of March 2024. So organisations have until March next year to update their existing contracts, which are currently reliant on the old SECs for data transfers. So March next year is a key date for the diary.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the drop dead date by next March.
Yeah.
Is it fair to say that people are already taking steps to try?
Oh yeah, definitely. Most organisations are doing that because you don't want to leave it to the last minute, especially if you've got lots of contracts to update or amend.
Perfect. I'm just going to pause just to say we are going to probably have time for some questions at the end. I see some questions already coming into the chat, which is great. If there's any others, please feel free to drop them in. So Scott, back to the data transfer. So we've mentioned the new data protection bill in the UK a few times. So what impact, if any, do you think the new bill will have on efforts made by organisations to update their contracts?
Well, in welcome news, the bill doesn't impose any or propose any significant changes in relation to the contracts and clauses for data transfers. Instead, the bill explicitly confirms that any lawful transfer mechanisms entered into before the bill takes effect will continue to be valid. So this is good news for organisations currently going through the contract update process, that no additional requirements will be introduced by the bill.
Good, that's good to know. So I suppose in general terms, what have you found organisations are doing in practice in relation to data transfers?
So for organisations that are major technology providers or vendors, i.e. data importers, we have found that one of the key things they are doing is updating their template contracts for UK-based customers to ensure they include both the USECs and the UK addendum. In addition, these major technology providers are proactively updating their existing contracts with customers in advance of the deadline in March 2020, March next year, usually by issuing written amendments or updating online terms. For other organisations, we have found that in practice, they are reviewing and mapping their data flows in order to identify data transfers to non-adequate countries. This includes reviewing intergroup data transfers and contracts with vendors. As many organisations find they're involved in transferring data to non-adequate countries such as the USA, they are then required to update their contracts either with intergroup companies or vendors. And this usually takes the form of an amendment to existing contracts and also updating contract templates to address new requirements. In addition, organisations are also updating their internal documentation, guidance and training on the issue of transfer risk assessments. And we've found that some organisations are putting in place their own bespoke transfer risk assessment questionnaire documents that are more suited to their requirements.
So you mentioned transfer risk assessments there. Can you maybe just explain a wee bit more about when exactly would you need to carry out a transfer risk assessment, and what actually does it involve in practice?
Yep, no problem. So essentially, there's a requirement for a data exporter to carry out a transfer risk assessment, or sometimes referred to as a transfer impact assessment, whenever the exporter relies on the new SECs plus UK addendum or the IDTA in order to carry out data transfers to an importer in a non-adequate country. This risk assessment helps organisations with their determination on whether it is acceptable to proceed with a data transfer to a non-adequate country, or whether it is necessary to put in place supplementary measures, such as encryption of data, in order to provide an essentially equivalent level of protection. Now, it's similar to the DPIAs. There is no mandatory format or document to use for this transfer risk assessment, but it should be in writing and should be maintained for accountability purposes. And the ICO has prepared very useful guidance on this issue, and including a helpful tool for transfer risk assessments, which is available on their website. As mentioned, organisations may wish to create or adapt their own bespoke questionnaires to be used for these assessments. Essentially, in line with ICO guidance, the key first thing is to consider the categories of data that are being transferred. If they're only low risk types of personal data, for example, just names and email addresses, then in most cases it should be okay to proceed with the data transfer. However, if transfers involving more sensitive types of data or any other types of data that is not obviously low risk, this would require more detailed consideration. In particular, the data exporter would be required to consider if, in practice, there is any significant increase in the risk to people's privacy rights if data is transferred to the specific data importer in the relevant non-adequate country, compared with the risk if it remains in the UK. But thankfully, the ICO has confirmed that exporters can take into account sort of a wider circumstances and carry out a reasonable and proportionate assessment of the situation in line with the context of the transfer.
Right. Okay. I suppose as a final point then, Scott, just to sum up, is there any top tips or key practical steps that you would consider in order to manage data transfers?
Definitely. So I would say to do the following. Firstly, map your data flows. It's important to understand intergroup and external data flows in order to establish whether there are any data transfers to non-adequate countries. Secondly, if you've not done so already, start a project to review and update your template contract documentation by including the appropriate data transfer mechanisms, either the IDTA or the new SECs plus the UK addendum. The approach here will depend on the size of your organisation and the nature of your business. If you're a large technology provider, for example, it will be necessary to incorporate the new SECs plus the UK addendum into your public-facing customer contracts or data protection addendums. If you're a smaller UK organisation, it may be sufficient to have a template IDTA amendment on file that can be used as required with counterparties. In addition to this, you should also start a project to review existing contracts which currently rely on the old SECs for data transfers to non-adequate countries, and then arrange for amendments to be put in place, which include the appropriate transfer mechanism. As mentioned, you have until March 2024 to update these contracts, so it's best to start the process now, especially if this involves amending a large number of contracts, just to be well before the deadline. Organisations should also provide staff with training and guidance on how to identify data transfers and new contracts and practical steps for how to deal with them. In addition to implementing the relevant clauses and contract documentation, it is also necessary to have a process in place for carrying out transfer risk assessments when reviewing data transfers to any non-adequate country. This can be done using the ICO's tool or a bespoke questionnaire that is more relevant or suited for your organisation's requirements. You should also provide staff with guidance on when it may be necessary to implement supplementary measures such as encryption in order to allow you to proceed with a data transfer to a non-adequate country. And also a final point, just continue to monitor any news and developments on adequacy regulations, which may reduce the work required for certain data transfers, e.g. transfers to the US. And these are all areas where the data privacy team at Burness Paull would be able to help, including reviewing contracts, monitoring developments, and updating training and guidance.
Amazing. Thanks, Scott, for that tour through data transfers, international data transfers. We've covered a lot today, and I'm just conscious of the time. I think we've got a couple of minutes for some questions, and I think some questions come through. So I think the first one possibly might be for you, Sonia. How should businesses manage legal privilege when conducting a DP gap analysis, or if requested, providing that analysis to incoming investors, potential acquirers? Is there a good way to balance having a proper record of things to improve without creating a document that would be unhelpful if disclosable? Example, regulatory investigation. So it's really that kind of that interaction between carrying out gap analysis and legal privilege. Sorry to put you on the spot, Sonia, but do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for that question, Michael. So, yeah, I think in the deal scenario, it has to be considered quite carefully, because in the disclosure process, obviously, if you know something that you're asked, then you must disclose. I don't know what you think, David, but I think the DP gap analysis in the deal scenario is probably most helpful if data is a big risk item for the business, but also where there's some like serious or anticipated to be some kind of serious blind spots in terms of compliance, like deal blockers, that kind of thing. And I guess the question to kind of ponder on is, will it improve your situation if you're able to say that you've carried out an audit and you've taken such and such steps to improve? And a few times I've been involved in diligence where the target had carried out an audit beforehand, and in those cases actually they didn't end up disclosing the audit, but the answers that they provided on data protections were quite complete in that sense. And I suppose likewise in the kind of regulatory investigation angle, it has to be kind of considered. So if it's the ICO, for example, and there's a regulatory investigation, I think what they would like to see is we're aware of the problem and we're working on it, as opposed to we're not aware of the problem at all. So I think those are my initial thoughts. And I suppose, I guess if there is an audit carried out and it reveals some serious risks, you'd have to control the release of that report quite carefully.
Thanks, Sonia. I think just in terms of timing, I think that's helpful. Scott, we've got one question at the end. I wonder if you can answer in like 10 seconds. For a new transfer, is the IDTA required, or could you do this through the addendum?
So you could do it through the new SECs plus the UK addendum. So that's how it works. So it's either the IDTA or the new SECs plus the UK addendum. So it's not necessary just to use the IDTA for all new transfers.
Yes, it's either or, IDTA.
Either or, yeah.
Indeed. look, we're coming to 10 o'clock and conscious we want to just close just before 10. So we've covered a lot today. I'm sure that if there are any additional questions, please feel free to reach out to any of us, and we will be circulating a copy of this recording around everyone as well. If you wanted to share that with your colleagues and there's any additional questions coming out of that, delighted to answer them. So many thanks for attending today, and have a good day.